That's he was like
the way I explain it, Mark is building the allegory, and they're still keeping seats. They're trying to get other stuff, right? The secrets just start leaking out. Matthew started like leak out the.
Okay, looks like we're all here. Yeah, I think we can begin now, because I think everybody's here. All right, so introduction, good afternoon. I want to welcome you to all to a panel discussion with me, Richard Carrier, and Robert M. Price. Before we begin, I have a few announcements to make and some ground rules for everyone to follow. All right, I'm Ehteshaam Gulam. I'm the organizer of this event, so I will be moderating this whole event. All right, now I'm going to give an introduction to our speakers for tonight. All right, Dr. Richard Carrier has a PhD in ancient history from Columbia University. He's written and authored several books, some of them being Historicity of Jesus, Why We Might Have Reason to Doubt, Sense of Goodness Without God, etc., etc. Robert M. Price has a PhD in theology from Drew University and a PhD in New Testament in Drew University. He has 3 master's degrees, one from Gordon Cornwell, Master of Philosophy and Theology, and from the same university. He's the author of several books, Shrinking Son of Man, The Amazing Colossal Apostle. He's hosted the Bible Geek, the show The Bible Geek, and he's edited the Journal of Higher Criticism. He's also host of the Human Bible as well as Lovecraft Geek. Both Richard and Bob have Patreon accounts, so if you want to support their work, if you're a fan of either or both, you can support them on Patreon. All right, so the format for this event will be me interviewing both my guests, Robert M. Price and Richard Carrier. When I do these things, I ask my guests to make a small introduction to themselves. So Richard, why don't you go first, and Bob, you go second. Just give us a brief introduction to yourselves.
I have my PhD from Columbia University in ancient history, but I also write on modern philosophy, modern atheist philosophy, naturalist philosophy. My specialties are intellectual history of the ancient world, so religion, science, philosophy, and of course origins of Christianity, which a lot of people know about my writings in that area as well. And I have degrees from other universities, but the PhD is, the big capital one that took a long time to actually accomplish. It was nice to finally get that. But I also teach online. I teach a course on either philosophy or ancient history in different subjects every month online. If you're interested in that, you can find that on my website. I blog and I write many books, which you can see on the table there. Feel free to browse and peruse those books, and later on I'll go ahead and sell and sign them if you want to get any of those. Take credit card and personal check and everything. To learn more about me, if you're interested, richardcarrier.info, so it's .info online. That's my website. You can find my Facebook account there, to follow me there, or my Twitter account, everything. My blog is there, and so on, and all my books, which are available in Audible, all read by me, and Kindle and various other formats as well.
Well, let's see, I now espouse views on the New Testament Christian origins that I never thought I would espouse. As I always like to say in the style of the 50s sci-fi movies I love, I was a teenage fundamentalist, but I gradually got out of that step by step, and I was, I guess you might say, a disappointed apologist. I wanted to defend the conservative evangelical faith, but the more I looked into the defenses of it, the more I very reluctantly had to admit it just didn't hold water, at least as far as I could tell. And began to look into all the writers, theologians, critics that I had always been told were the bad guys, and decided, well, I guess maybe they're the good guys. But in my approach, I do not really have bad guys in my books on the Bible Geek and so forth. I try to just look at the issues and the theories of different scholars, whether I think they hold water or not. But it's obvious to me that aside from a few hacks that get attention they don't deserve, the traditionalist conservative scholars are genuinely fine scholars. They just don't have the same perspective, and so I've always learned from them what I can and give them due respect. So I try not to get nasty about any of that stuff. There's just no point in that. I respect the people I disagree with, and for one thing, though I am not a believer in God anymore, so I guess I am technically an atheist. I don't feel myself really part of an atheist movement. Like, I personally don't care what anybody believes, and I don't want to become the mirror image of my fundamentalist self, pursuing this evangelistic goal to get people to renounce belief in God. What do I care what anybody thinks? Right? I mean, they shouldn't care what I think, because my goal is just to try to be Socratic and to provide information and perspectives that my readers or hearers may not have been familiar with, and which they can now apply to their own synthesis. I mean, I certainly don't try to get people to become Priceans. What a foolish. I just want to help them do their own thing as I have done. So I'm really dedicated to that. Another cliche, some of my best friends are fundamentalists. That remains true. I've become friends with a lot of the people I've debated because I don't look at, I don't have an ideological litmus test for friends or colleagues. So that's kind of my approach. And one other oddball thing, I do these things that have already been listed, the books and so on, and the podcasts. I have a monthly column called Zarathustra Speaks, and I've just become one of the board members of Republican Atheists. There is such a thing, so I've got all kinds of irons in the fire.
And Lovecraft.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, I've edited a score of anthologies of H.P. Lovecraft-related horror anthologies, and I've got a couple of nonfiction books on Lovecraft. I write heroic fantasy. I've written some adventures of Conan and Thongor the Barbarians. I'm a comic book fanatic, an action figure collector. So there's any number of reasons you might want to call in the guys with the white coats.
All right, so we have some latecomers. That's fine. So I guess my first question would be to both of you. Wouldn't it make, like, I believe that there was a historical Jesus, and even if I wasn't a Muslim, let's say I became an atheist tomorrow, I would still believe there was a Jesus. So wouldn't it make more sense to say Jesus was the Clark Kent, using your analogy, Jesus was the Clark Kent, then eventually became the Superman, or was it always he was the Superman, then he became the Clark Kent? So Bob, you want to answer first?
Well, I use this analogy in my debate with Bart Ehrman, that you can say that, of course, the Gospels are filled with legends and these miracle stories, they didn't happen or they're allegorical or whatever, but there must have been a more modest historical figure, a sage, a philosopher, a prophet or something, whose followers greatly hyped him up and magnified him. This has a superficial plausibility, and it's what I thought for a long time, but it finally occurred to me, and I'm not the only one, that you have to ask, what would it have, well, this comes up with the question, why don't ancient writers refer to Jesus if he was such a miracle-working Superman? And the answer Bart and many others give is, well, of course, a lot of it's legend, but he wasn't the kind of person you would take such note of. And so, you're going to find references to Oral Roberts in American history textbooks? I doubt it. Well, the problem with that is, why did the early Christians make such a big deal of this guy? You have to ask that too. And it's as if you decided to do the quest of the historical Superman, and you had decided, okay, I think I've proven that Superman did exist. but he was just Clark Kent. Would there ever have been any Clark Kent comics? Would Clark Kent have been the star of Action Comics? Would Clark Kent have been a member of the Justice League? I mean, it seems to me unreasonable. If there was such a character, so what? But if there was, you know, why would he have been magnified like this? So I just find that a real poor argument for a historical Jesus.
Well, also Clark Kent didn't exist either.
So that's right, but I mean, you know,
That's the other thing about that, is, I mean, it starts when you look at how mythologized Jesus is, and we have no mundane histories of Jesus. If you compare this to like Haile Selassie, who's, you know, worshipped as the Christ by the Rastafarians. Haile Selassie was, you know, the emperor of Ethiopia. He was a real historical person. We have a lot of mundane records of what he was like and the truth of him and stuff. He even renounced and denied that he was the Christ figure. He was a Christian himself, and so he thought it was actually blasphemous that anyone was worshiping him. And yet they wrote these incredible gospels about him and the amazing things he did, and, you know, the sort of the nativity narratives and all of this stuff, all the same stuff you see about Jesus. So here we have a historical person who gets magnified, and there's just a crazy sequence of events as to how that happens, even though he's denying it, you know, himself, and yet it still happens and becomes a major world religion. It's still going on, still today. For Jesus, we don't see that. We see the amazing, you know, miracle stories and stuff like right out of the gate. There's no mundane Jesus. And when you look further earlier on, you see the letters of Paul. Paul only knows about an outer space Jesus. Like his Jesus, he never talks about Jesus being on earth or having a ministry or any of this. It's just something that you have conversations with. I mean, Paul even relates in 2 Corinthians 12, an actual conversation he has with Jesus. He has like this argument with Jesus. The Jesus he's arguing with is in his head, right? It's like it's not an actual person. He doesn't refer to anyone else meeting Jesus in any other way. It seems like he seems to think that this was just a revelatory being. That's how you meet Jesus. That's how he appoints you an apostle. And so when you compare those two things, you add them up, it's like, you know, A plus B, like it does slightly favor the possibility that he began this revelatory being and got placed in history, as so many other gods at that time did. There are a lot of non-historical persons that became deified and then put into history as if they were regular people. Romulus, Osiris, Zalmoxis, probably. Many of these different things. So that's why I think, yes, the Clark Kent analogy is really, there never was a Clark Kent. Like, there's no record of a Clark Kent Jesus. There's only Super Jesus. And this is a question of which Super Jesus was earlier, and the Space Jesus is the earlier one. So, so what modern historians are doing is as if there were no Clark Kent in the Superman comics, and they're speculating, well, Superman existed because he could have been this Clark Kent character. So they're inventing Clark Kent to sort of explain why Superman could historically exist.
That well put.
Yeah, it doesn't really work, but that's my answer for that question.
Okay, for Bob, maybe what's the strongest argument against mythicism?
I think that this doesn't mean it's a decisive argument. In fact, almost no arguments are decisive. It's a frustrating thing that history writing, well, like scientific theorizing too, is always tentative and provisional, and that means open to correction. You have to say, well, the preponderance of the evidence makes this look likely, but who knows? I mean, how many times has the consensus on this or that changed? And this would not even be controversial, except that we're debating and dissenting from dogmatist believers who want certainty, and they have it psychologically because they've decided to believe this or that. But when they get into apologetics, the defense of the faith, they're trying to use what are inherently probabilistic methods to arrive at certainty. And even if the evidence looked pretty good, you couldn't justify that. So there's this huge methodological gap between us and the folks we debate. They've already made up their minds and so on. So having said that, I think the best argument on the side of historicists for Jesus is the Caliphate of James, as I think Parnack once called it. The fact that there are traditions that, I think the heresy of arms, there were traditions that James called the Just was the brother of Jesus, and after Jesus vanished from the earth, James became the first bishop of Jerusalem, which would almost have to be kind of anachronistic, but that he became the leader of the movement in Jesus' absence, and that when he died, Simeon Bar Cleophas, another one of the brothers of Jesus listed in Mark chapter 6, I guess, right? 6:3, I think it is, when it says his brothers, James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon, are they not here, and his sisters, these people would have one by one taken the helm of the movement or of the Jerusalem church. And this pattern is somewhat similar to the caliphate in Islam. After Muhammad dies, some of his companions, Abu Bakr, Uthman, and Umar, became the caretaker of the community, one after the other. There's similarities in the succession of successors to Joseph Smith and Mormonism. The principle of analogy would lead us to say, well, this looks kind of like that phenomenon. It gives a sense of plausibility to the idea that if there's a caliphate, a succession of caretakers of the movement following Jesus, that there was a Jesus who was, like he said, the bridegroom is taken away. It's just that that is not compelling. I mean, that does have a ring of historical plausibility about it, but the evidence it's based on is really pretty fragmentary. You're not only connecting the dots, but some of the dots, there might be fly specks or marks in the paper or something. So, but I think that does lend a certain plausibility to the idea that there was a historical Jesus, but that's about it. It's not that strong, and yet I think it's the strongest argument on that side.
Yeah, I agree. And from another perspective, just from a straightforward data perspective, there are basically two passages in the letters of Paul where he mentions brothers of the Lord, and then that comes to what does he mean by that? And that's where the debate goes around. They say, well, of course he means biological brothers, and it's not that obvious. Paul says all baptized Christians are brothers of the Lord. So are we talking about baptized Christians? Is this a title? Is this a sort of rank in the society? Do they mean biological Christians or biological siblings? It's unclear. And then there are references to maybe Jesus having parents, and those are problematic as well for a lot of ways. Now, if those passages didn't exist, I think historicity would be really dead in the water. I mean, I don't think there would be any way to really sustain it, other than I think the next argument is that you can't have a crucifixion and burial in heaven, or it has to be on earth. There's the only way. It has to be a historical event, otherwise they would never invent or imagine a crucifixion and burial not on earth or in history unless it really happened. And that's the next best argument, I would say. But that we have answers to that too. There's those kinds of space events occur all the time. Satan had a whole war with Satan and his legion of angels had a war in heaven. It's like, how can you have a war in heaven? Wars can only happen on earth. It's like, well, no. Lots of things happen in heaven. Adam's body was buried in heaven, in the third heaven, according to the life of Adam and Eve. The angels took their bodies up and buried them. The Garden of Eden is in the third heaven. Paul even says in 2 Corinthians 12, he went up to the third heaven into paradise, the Garden of Eden. So there's whole gardens in outer space. There's all kinds of things where people can be buried, killed, fight wars, all this sort of stuff can happen there. And it sounds weird to us today because we live in a modern scientific society, but back then they really did imagine all this stuff existed up there and all this stuff happened up there. They had a different worldview. So things that seem weird to us today did not seem weird to them back then. And so when you look at it in context, well, it looks very different.
Well, look at the book of Revelation, where it's definitely up in heaven, and the object of worship is the Lamb who was slain. And all this, it doesn't say that he was slain on earth. You're dealing with a heavenly scene.
Yeah, it doesn't even say like the dragons chasing Mary through the heavens or something like that. So there's a lot of references to stuff going on in outer space in Revelation. But then of course people will say, well, Revelation is just allegory. They don't mean literally. And so on. But Revelation is weak to work with because it's so bizarre, and so strange that people say, well, it can't be taken literally, it must mean something else, and then of course that opens the Pandora's box, and it could mean anything. So it's hard to work with as a historian.
Okay, two other things I forgot to mention. For the after party, carrier has to leave by 8 p.m. or 7:30 p.m. So at the after party, we'll decide where to go after. It's just going to be me, Bob, and anybody who wants to join. So we'll talk about that after the audience Q&A. And Bob doesn't have any books, but if you have a book you want Bob to sign, after the audience Q&A, carrier will be selling his books and Bob's will be signing any books you have. So next question would be, can you give us some reasons why the Old Testament books aren't historically reliable? Like why we can't take Genesis and all that as to be historical fact? Bob, you first and then Richard.
Well, the thing that, a lot of stuff like Adam and Eve is so obviously symbolic. I remember Clark Pinnock, an evangelical theologian, said, when you got a story and the main character his name means man, you gotta wonder if this is if anybody ever thought in the ancient world that this was literally true. But there's so much of it, even in the so-called Deuteronomic history, the stuff between Joshua and 2 Kings, that seems to be in the real world with wars of conquest and all kinds of things. A lot of that is novelistic. The descriptions focus on scenes of characters saying this to one another and doing that to one another, not the kind of thing that anybody records in history. It's all fiction writing. I mean, how would the writer have known exactly what David said to his wife while Saul's goons were hunting for him and all that? How would that survive? I like what Gunkel said about the stories of Abraham and Sarah. He says, look, according to the Bible, the Israelites are in Egypt for 4 centuries, and we hear nothing about it. But somehow, in the days before that, they remembered exactly what Abraham and Sarah said to each other having arguments. That's absurd. But then later on, when you get to stuff that does sound like there's some history to it, with the kings of Israel and Judah, Jehoshaphat and Ahab and all these people. And by the way, it never says anything about jumping with Jehoshaphat. This stuff is also novelistic, and but the thing that really kills it is the archaeological problem. You always hear from apologists who are totally out of date on this, that the Bible is backed up by archaeological discovery. Now, that's like what Constantine's mother did, sending researchers to the Middle East to find the true cross and the true tomb and the spear of Longinus and stuff. They found a tomb, it's Jesus' tomb. It's pin the tail on the archaeological site. That's what these guys like William F. Albright did. They were trying to find stuff. Oh, city near the Dead Sea, must be Sodom, and so forth. Once you actually did strict archaeology like Thomas L. Thompson and others have done, it just falls apart. Like there's no evidence of a Temple of Solomon. What happened to it? I mean, did God send angels with vacuum cleaners down to get all the ruins of it up? I mean, they say, oh, we found a little pomegranate-shaped nodule that had been on top of a fence post or something in the temple. That's all? I mean, isn't that sort of the exception that proves the rule? What happened to the rest of it? It's on level with saying Satan planted dinosaur bones to throw us off the track. And there weren't enough people in the area of Judea to have a monarchy there. There's no evidence that there ever was a Judean monarchy until like the time of the Hasmoneans. There was an Israelite monarchy in the north, but it never had anything to do with Judah in the south, which was more of a kind of distribution network for olive oil that was a major product down there. And so it's like King Arthur and Camelot and Avalon and all of that. There would have to be evidence, or the Exodus. Pick any hypothetical route you want from Egypt across the Sinai. There are about 3 major theoretical ones. What happened here? Millions of people and huge herds of cattle supposedly crossed the Sinai desert, which the Bible describes as a howling waste. How'd they feed anybody? And where is any evidence of this? I mean, we have infrared photography that can uncover ancient caravan routes on the Sinai Peninsula, and nothing anywhere that would match the Exodus. It just didn't happen, because again, you got to come up with the angels with the vacuum cleaners. It's like they're vacuuming up the ticker tape parade or something. There's just no evidence where there would have to be evidence. And so the whole thing appears to be a kind of a national epic. And great stuff. I love it, but it's not history.
Richard?
It's the Jewish Homer, right? So,
Yeah.
like, you know, you can say, well, we found a city in Troy that was burned down roughly around the time when the Trojan War was said to have happened, but that doesn't mean anything written in Homer is actually what happened. Especially since we know, like, Homer, for example, if you read the Iliad, there are random scenes mixed in and out of these characters interacting throughout the course of the book, in which, in one part, they're actually using iron weapons and wearing iron armor, and then another using bronze weapons wearing bronze armor. So Homer was written over so many centuries that it literally went from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. So clearly this all didn't happen at the same time, right? This is a story. There was no Homer who sat down and wrote this down. There may have been a Homer who was the last compiler who wrote down a bardic song that was passed on to him, but that song was written and added to over centuries and centuries, and it's just all mythical stuff that they made up to tell stories, and there's no evidence that any of it is really true. And so it's the same thing with the Bible. There might be little pieces of historical data, like the name David may have been a warlord at some point, or some tribal chief or something. They hang an entire, they say, well, we'll pick that, we're going to create a whole narrative around this guy. And the reason we know this is plausible is because they kept doing it. There's this thing, a lot of people don't know this, in the 1st century AD there's this book called the Biblical Antiquities that some bunch of Jewish writers wrote. And they picked all these minor characters in the Bible that hardly have any stories about them, and then it fleshed out entire stories for them. And suddenly they have magical knowledge of this in the 1st century AD. It's like, oh, so-and-so, we're going to write a whole narrative about this. And they wrote whole lives of Moses that expanded on the story of Moses, and so they kept doing these things. They would pick like one little thing and write a whole thing about it. And it's funny because like today we would call that fan fiction. My favorite fan fiction is Enoch, right? So there's one line in Genesis where it says, and then the Watchers came down from outer space and had sex with women, and then there were these weird creatures, the Nephilim. And then it moves on. This is one line, and it moves on, and then moving on, and then any normal reader does it. Whoa, hold on, what? And so someone picked that line and invented an entire book of the Bible to spell it out. So what does that mean? They told this whole story about these angels having sex with women and teaching them sorcery, and that's how sorcery got into the world.
And cosmetics.
And cosmetics, yes, sorcery and cosmetics. And science, incidentally. So all these evil things. And so someone did this whole fan fiction thing, created the Book of Enoch, and Christianity was using, when the first Christians started, they were using the Book of Enoch as scripture. It was part of their holy scripture. A lot of their religion is built out of the ideas and concepts in the Book of Enoch. So, and that's not in our Old Testament. We forget that. We think like the Christians were only using the Old Testament as we have it today, and that's not the case. Their collection of scriptures were weirder and different and broader.
And there still is in Ethiopia. They have the much bigger canon that has several of the apostolic fathers, Enoch, and all kinds of stuff, and that's the Bible. Still, 3rd Corinthians is part of the canon of the Armenian Orthodox Church. So what is the Bible?